Hi, everyone. My name is Constance Brown, and I'm the managing attorney for the Pro Bono unit at Memphis Area Legal Services. I am happy to be here today to provide you with some information regarding restoring your right to vote in the event that the right to vote was lost. With me today, we have Joy Whiteley, who is here to learn more about the voter restoration process, and Ms. Shakara Thomas, my paralegal. I'll let Shakara share a couple of words before we get started.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Shakara Thomas. I'm the paralegal for the Pro Bono unit at Memphis Area Legal Services. I'm happy to be here. I hope that this recording can, give you some imperative information to assist you with restoring your rights to vote. And if you have any questions, I hope that by the end of this recording, everything is answered and you can do what you need to do to restore those rights.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're just going to wait for the screen to actually start sharing the slides. So just a little bit of background. Voter restoration in the state of Tennessee is governed by statute TCA 40-29-201, which is reflected on this slide. I'm not going to read it out to you, but I'll let the slide sit here for a couple of seconds just so you could kind of look at it and just get your own understanding of the statute. All right, next slide, please. So voter restoration in a nutshell requires the following. The person must have completed all sentence requirements, including the payment of court costs, parole and probation. The individual must also be up to date on all child support orders. The next step would be to apply for a certificate of restoration, and the court clerk or the probation parole officer must complete that form and certify eligibility. Once certified, the person will submit the certificate of restoration to the Election Commission office in Shelby County. So, very important to note that unlike conviction expungement, an individual is not required to wait for a time period to pass after the completion of the sentence to apply for voter restoration. As long as the individual has fulfilled all requirements of his sentencing, the person may commence the voter restoration process immediately. So again, it is required that the payment of all fees, fines, program costs, etc., be paid prior to that person's voting rights being restored. It is also very worth noting that Tennessee is unique in that it requires that an individual is current on child support payments before voting rights can be restored. So this would mean that a payment plan is not sufficient. The costs must be fully satisfied. Next slide, please. When a Tennessee resident is convicted of a felony, the individual typically loses the right to vote. There are, however, steps that can be taken to restore this person's right to vote, given certain circumstances. So to that point, do bear in mind that there are certain convictions that will render a person disenfranchised forever. So it's very important that we note the time period that the felony occurred and the type of felony that occurred. So on this chart, we see the disqualifying convictions. From the time period of May 17th, 1981 to June 30th, 1986, all convictions are eligible for a certificate of restoration. Now, for the time period of July 1986 to June 30th, 1996, the disqualifying convictions would be first-degree murder, aggravated rape, treason, and voter fraud. For the time period of July 1st, 1996 to June 30th, 2006, your disqualifying convictions, any degree of murder, any degree of rape, including aggravated rape, treason, and voter fraud. For the time period of July 1st, 2006 to present, your disqualifying convictions are any degree of murder, any degree of rape, including aggravated rape, treason, voter fraud, bribery, misconduct involving a public official or employee, interference with government operation, and any sexual offense that has been designated as a felony. So again, when determining whether a client is potentially eligible for voting rights restoration, ask these essential questions. 1, what was the person convicted of? Was it a misdemeanor or was it a felony? Because if it was a misdemeanor, you never lost your right to vote. If it was a felony, you very likely did lose your right to vote. Second, based on that conviction, can this person regain the right to vote? So during that analysis, always refer to the time period and the type of conviction. So as mentioned, a certificate of voting restoration may be used to restore an individual's voting rights for a felony conviction on or after May 18th, 1981. Next slide, please. This form must be completed by a probation or parole officer or a court clerk. These individuals and entities, they would have that required information regarding an individual's conviction, the final release date, and information regarding restitution or court costs. The person convicted of the felony offense may not complete the restoration of voting rights form himself. Very important to note that a separate certificate of voting restoration form must be completed for each felony conviction with a different docket case number. In addition to convictions in the state of Tennessee, this applies to federal convictions as well as convictions that occur in another state. So let's just go through a step-by-step process of the restoration of voting rights. So step 1. The certificate of voter restoration, again, must be completed by the court clerk or the parole officer. Important to note right here that the persons who obtain this certificate of restoration form are only eligible to apply for restoration if and only if they have completed the sentence imposed for the felony conviction, they have paid all restitution to the victim or victims of the offense ordered by the court as part of that sentence. They have paid all court costs assessed against the person at the conclusion of that person's trial, except where the court has made a finding at an evidentiary hearing that the applicant is indigent at the time of application. Now, that would be a situation where a court cost waiver should be considered, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later in the presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, a person must be current on all child support obligations. Step 2, the client will submit the completed certificate of voter restoration to the administrator of elections in the county where the participant is eligible to vote. Step 3, the administrator of elections sends the certificate to the coordinator of elections to verify that the certificate of voter restoration was issued in compliance with Tennessee statute section 49-29-403. Step 4, the coordinator will notify the administrator of elections in the county of request that the certification is valid. Step 5, the administrator of elections determines that the participant is qualified to vote using verification procedures used for any applicant. Step 6, the administrator of election will then grant an application for voter registration. And the 7th and final step, the administrator of elections shall issue a voter registration card to be mailed to the participant in the same way a new voter registration card is ordinarily mailed. Next slide, please. So just so you can actually see what the certificate of restoration looks like, this is the actual form. There are a couple of different ways that you can access this form. One way would be to go to the local county election office or to actually navigate to the Tennessee Election Commission's website. And I'll just let it linger here for a couple of seconds just so you can get a good look at what the actual certificate of restoration form looks like and the kind of information that the parole officer and the court clerk's office would include on that form. Okay. Next slide, please. In here, this slide is just basically listing additional options in regard to a voter restoration. One of which is mentioned is that if a person is unable to restore their right to vote through a certificate of restoration, they may be able to ask for a pardon from the governor. That's a very rare circumstance. But I did want to just mention it here, just so you would know there are other options, no matter how rare. Next slide, please. And I do want to briefly just circle back to court cost waivers. And this slide here is just basically a recap of restoring the right to vote condensed. It's the same steps that I just mentioned. The slide just has condensed them a little bit more. So while you review that, I'll just briefly go over the court cost waiver piece that I mentioned earlier. Because court cost waivers are very, very important when it comes to voter rights restoration, because there may be times when a person actually does owe court debt. But court debt, any court debt, all court debt must be fully satisfied before a person can even restore their right to vote. So the first step in regard to a court cost waiver is one, gathering information. So to successfully petition for the waiver of an individual's court debt, you must gather the necessary information regarding that person's ability to pay. So this includes information that comes from the client, as well as information that comes from the relevant court clerk's office. It's always advisable to talk to the client and find out from the client firsthand what their financial situation is. Sometimes you may learn that the person has medical issues, or the person has recently become unemployed, or maybe the person has just gotten a job, but they have yet to receive their first paycheck. So essentially, even though there is some money there, there's still not enough to satisfy, let's just say, like a $2,000, $5,000, $8,000 court cost debt. So that would be something that a judge would definitely need to hear if you're presenting the waiver. Also, very important to know and suggested is to, days before the hearing, request the jacket from the relevant clerk's office just to become familiar with the history of the case. It's also really important to request an updated statement of a person's costs. That can come in the form of a cost bill, and that will break down each individual fine, fee, and the tax that the individual owes. And also it includes the statutes that authorize them. So that was just like a little brief overview of like a court cost waiver, how it can be presented, what you basically, the information you're looking for before you present one. And that, I believe, is the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Let me just make sure. Yep. So that's the end. And now, if you guys have any questions, I will do my best to answer those for you.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
So you may have already answered it, but I was convicted of a felony and I have completed my probation and my parole. So can I vote now?
You were convicted of a felony and you completed your probation and your parole. So now you want to know, can you vote? So that would depend. Do you owe court costs? Do you owe child support? So let's just say you don't owe court costs and you don't owe child support. In this instance, you can go ahead and get the certificate of restoration form. And as I mentioned, your parole officer or the clerk's office will complete that for you. Now, if you do owe court costs, those costs will have to be paid, or you would have to have a successful petition of a court cost waiver to satisfy that debt. And if you owe child support, you have to become completely current on your child support. Again, you cannot be on a payment plan, regardless of whether or not the payment plan, you're current on that. It does not matter. You cannot have any balance at all in terms of child support if that applies to you.
Okay, so a follow-up to that question would be, again, I was just released. How do I find out if I have court costs or child support debt?
Well, the first thing that you would do is you need to contact as far as court costs, you can contact the clerk's office to see what you owe. Now, if the attorney is working on your case, you would definitely be able to have them to reach out to the clerk's office, or they could pull it. You could also pull it from the CJS portal to see if there are any costs that have been assessed that have not yet been paid. But again, the best remedy would be for you to go directly to the clerk's office via phone, if possible, and just find out if there are any costs. And regarding your question about how do you find out how much you owe, if you do owe something, contact your local child support office to request the balance on your case or your multiple cases if there are more than one.
Okay. So another question would be, did I lose my right to vote if I only have a misdemeanor?
No, you only lose your right to vote if you have been convicted of a felony. So if you have a misdemeanor, you never lost your right to vote.
Oh, okay. Also, can I regain my right to vote if I owe court costs?
You would have to pay those court costs off first, or you have to successfully petition for a court cost waiver. And another tip that I recently learned about is, let's just say you are before a court that requires you to pay your balance in full, like they refuse to waive anything. You may be able to ask the court to just waive the requirement that you pay your amount in full before before petitioning to have your voter rights restored. That way you will still be responsible for the balance that you owe, but it would not hinder you from completing a certificate of restoration to regain your right to vote.
Okay. And last question is, can I regain my right to vote if I am still on probation?
No, you have to complete all of your probation, sentencing requirements, all of that before you can submit a certificate of restoration.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Constance.
Hi, Joy.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It gave me some knowledge about the vote restoration. Although I don't have a right to vote, but I'm curious to learn about the whole process about the vote restoration. How long it takes the whole process?
Well, the process itself, it could definitely vary because there are so many different channels that the paperwork has to move through. So the initial steps, I would not think that they would take longer than a week. And by initial steps, I mean just figuring out whether or not the person has actually been convicted, of a misdemeanor or a felony, and then assessing whether or not there are actually any costs owed, court costs or child support costs. And once you have figured all of that out and you're able to say, well, okay, I've looked at the time frames. I see which felony I was convicted of. I see which time frame it falls within. I'm not disqualified based on that. So now I don't owe any child support, so that's not an issue, and I don't owe any costs. Well, at that point, you can go ahead, get your certificate of restoration form, and it will have to be completed by the probation officer or the clerk's office. And from there, it just moves through all those steps that I mentioned earlier. So although we don't know a specific time frame for that initial part that's the most important part that the client can ensure is done to expedite the rest of the process. Because once they have all the information they need on the front end, they can go ahead and handle the steps that they need to handle.
Yeah, thank you for answering my question. I understand it varies, depends on the situation. And I would like to know, during the process, do I need to involve the attorney's help, or your office will provide the pro bono service? Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you for asking that. That's a very good question. Yes, our pro bono department, through our partnership with International Paper, Butler Snow, Fastberry, and Just City, we are actively taking expungement cases on, and we're taking cases where people are interested in getting their voter restoration rights restored and also their driver's license reinstated. So we are actively taking all of those free of charge. And outside of the partnership, MALS itself as an entity, sometimes we partner with the law school and we're able to handle cases in that way as well. So absolutely give us a call, shoot us the email, and we can get you registered and find a volunteer attorney to take on your matter.
That sounds great. I can get the free legal service. Is that everybody can get the free legal service, or do you have a special requirement?
That's another good question. So ordinarily, when you come through MALS, you have to go through a intake process where your financial eligibility is assessed and is determined based upon that whether or not you qualify. But for the particular pro bono initiative alliance that's focused on the restoration of rights, which is your expungements, your driver's license restoration, and your voter restoration, the eligibility requirement is not conclusive. It doesn't determine whether or not you can be assisted. You can still be assisted because we do virtual clinics, and we still have those volunteer attorneys within their partnership that are able to take on those cases. So the eligibility requirement is not as stringent when it comes to the expungements regarding the partnership. And actually, Shakara, could you share a little bit more about our eligibility in general for our other MALS cases?
Oh, absolutely. The eligibility process, it's a fairly easy, quick, painless process. You would come to me. I would gather some information from you regarding your household size, your income, and then the system kind of does what it needs to from there to determine whether you're eligible or not. I will say that just as a roundabout, for one person household, you can't make any more than about $26,000 a year. Just to kind of give you an idea on how much more strict the system is with our other cases than it is for the expungement cases. As Constance stated, we are partnered with a few other of our alliances, so that process is a little bit easier to get through. That way we can assist more people on a larger scale.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering my questions.
Well, thanks, you guys. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for your great questions. I do hope that the presentation has been informative. And for anyone out there that is watching, if you know anyone who needs help with an expungement case or having their voting rights restored or driver's license reinstatement, send them our way. My email is cbrown@malsi.org. Shakara's SThomas@malsi.org, and we will do our best to make sure that person intake is conducted and that they are added to our client list. And that's all we have for today. Thanks.
Thank you.